get to the slide. So podcasting for introverts, so how to connect and build high quality relationships and opportunities globally. And it's interesting because one of the reasons I love speaking about this is because I've heard the saying so often, well, I can't really do podcasting because I'm an introvert, to which I respond, well, so am I. And people are often quite taken aback. I mean, I am an extroverted introvert, so put a microphone in front of me. It's just a place that I love to be. However, you know, I think the difference between extroverts and introverts, they're both great. And we bring as introverts a real depth to the conversation. So today I wanted to share podcasting for introverts, the benefits, podcasting on your terms, and then some must-dos with your podcast to make sure that it not only builds reach, not only builds your reputation, but also enables you to start to leverage that audience, nurture them from listeners into leads, inquiries, and ultimately paying customers. So I want to debunk the myth. You know, podcasting is best suited for introverts, which is total BS. And so much so that I created a podcast episode that if you want to go and have a listen to it later, just go to annamariecross.com/introvert, where I asked that question, you know, who is better suited as the podcast host? And I think both, you know, extroverts and introverts bring value in a very different approach to the conversation. And so if someone's listening or watching this, even down the track, the recording, if you are an introvert and think, well, podcasting's not for me, one of the reasons I started podcasting was in view of, say, video. Now I'm doing a lot more video and lives, is that you never have a bad hair day with a podcast, audio podcast, because it's audio. So that's another reason as well. Now, some of the other reasons that I started a podcast, some of the benefits, I mean, if I have a look back to when we first started, I mean, Keith, you and I started our very first podcast back in 2008, using technology, which was quite, you know, if we compare it to what's available now, we did with what we had available. However, you know, we were able to amplify our message, build reach beyond what we ever thought would be possible if we just relied on face-to-face and some of the traditional media and mediums at that time, which wasn't really online as much. I mean, that was certainly starting to come to its own, but certainly not, you know, as wide or as vast as it is now. And so some of the things that I have found, I mean, I have had opportunities to speak with guests from other parts of the world. I mean, Julian has recently been part of our panel, so we've had the opportunity to connect. Great way to build relationships. And in actual fact, that is one of the reasons why I do have podcasts, because it's a way for me to get to know someone. And if I'm able to meet them at a face-to-face event later, then there's a connection that I've already built. So definitely building connections. Through those opportunities, I've had opportunities to speak on virtual summits, in person, clients, sponsors. I mean, just a myriad of opportunities that have come just through sharing my voice, sharing my platform with other people who've come on the podcast as a guest. And so, you know, building that know, like, and trust with people who I've then developed relationships with as alliance partners or just friends, I think is a huge benefit. Also clients, you know, we have an opportunity using the technology of a podcast to be in someone's ear. And if you can do that on a regular basis, you know, every week or fortnight, which is every 2 weeks, a term I'm not sure that you have in Canada or the US, a fortnight. That is,
it's the video game. That's how now what kids refer to. It's this game where they go around and shoot each other up. So, which I'm not a fan of.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to be very mindful to discern between that I mentioned around every fortnight. There we go. But you know, there is the benefits to podcasting that I think has been incredible, and even weaving it now within your customer journey, and with, you know, obviously the mediums that you use. And for instance, you know, video is fantastic, but we don't really have a lot of time to spend watching videos for long periods of time. And it's interesting, the neuroscience that is coming through that is confirming that there's a lot more brain power used when, you know, with videos, whereas with audio, not so much, which is why people are opting for less, screen time and listening to audios because it's a secondary activity, and they can continue to, to listen to your voice whilst also commute and exercise and that. So that's really exciting. It's a benefit, a way in which you can continue to share that message, and do so as an introvert, because you're not having to get out in front of a lot of people, although a lot of people can access your content because it's available 24/7, 365 days a year. Now, some of the other benefits that I've had, which was very unexpected, was being syndicated on national radio and in international radio. I mean, one of my listeners, and I think, Keith, you've since spoken to Tony Friday, which was a DJ on a local radio station in Zimbabwe, who happened to hear a couple of episodes, and from there was quite an avid listener. He's still part of my community, but asked if he could syndicate my show, Ambitious Entrepreneur Show, on his radio station in Zimbabwe. So you just don't know where your voice ends up. And then, of course, the Christian Entrepreneur Podcast, which is another podcast that's now syndicated in a local radio station in Perth. So you just don't know where your voice ends up and who you will impact. So, benefits of podcasting, I could go on, but anyway, I want to dive into the next slide. Do you have anything to add to that, Keith? The benefits have been awesome, isn't it? The connection.
Well, let's pick up on where you've started. In 2008, we did a radio show called Career Success Radio. And let's just play this out, what you've just said there, because we were syndicated on a radio network called Job FM, which was a global career network of podcasts around the world for people who wanted to change careers. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot of people that want to do that. And the thing that's great about podcasting, as you said, it doesn't tax a lot of your brain, because you can work out, you can go on the train, you can drive. So you just, as you said, you never know where your voice is going to end up. And it's a very low barrier to entry, because, as you said, there's no hair day.
Yes.
Right? There's no bad hair day. It's a very good place to start the journey of getting your brand out there. And at that time, 2008, we were in an environment where people said, mate, sit in a room, do one-on-ones, just suck it up. And we reached, at one particular day, 1,800 people in one day with 1 hour podcasting on iTunes. I mean, the comparison in terms of reach is out of this world. It's not, there's no comparison. Do you have a comparative story, Julian, about reach for podcasting and or video and how they differ?
Well, I mean, I agree that, it's, I don't know if I have a comparison in terms of, one necessarily being better. There's no question though that, podcasting has almost been the surprise, in that there's a lot of assumption, although the video is going to take over, but it's precisely to the point that you're saying, that it's found time, that all of a sudden now people are really valuing. So exactly as you said, you can listen to a podcast while you drive your car, and that ability to expand your learning while you're doing something else is just an unbelievable thing. And I think the other thing that I'll, say to the benefits, because I've done that, with my show, exactly as Annemarie was saying, so you get to meet interesting people and learn from them. The other thing about that too is that, sometimes these are experts. Now, if you were to reach out to an expert, is somebody who is, super successful, and just say, hi, could I have 30 minutes of your time or an hour of your time? I'd like to call you. They might not necessarily be willing to give that to you, but if you say, hi, I'd like to have you as a guest on my show, that's a little different. Now you're giving them exposure, as you said. You're exposing your audience, audience to their, and it's that exchange of that, and then you both sort of get this credibility boost, in the sense that now they sort of are seen with you, you're seen with them. You're sharing each other's audiences, because without a doubt, the second that anybody's on your show, they want to know, anytime that anybody comes on my show, they say, okay, well, let me know when you post it live, because they very much want to take that opportunity now and share it with it. So, the guiding principle behind my show, which from day one, which has absolutely proven true, is the rising tide lifts all ships.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, Great.
Okay, well,
yeah.
What's next? Keep going.
Yeah, and just before we move on, and just to add that to, you know, take what Julian was saying, it's absolutely true. And especially when you think there is a lot of noise and a lot of content, and I don't believe one is better than the other, but it's how you use that. And I think it follows on beautifully from what Jeff was saying. You have to have a clear idea on where you want to, you know, to have that voice, where you want to become known as that thought leader. But another benefit that we're using, and I probably won't go too much into this in this particular session, but now what I'm saying with a lot of my clients is to leverage the podcast, but as a way to use that as a funnel. You know, when I talk about nurturing listeners into leads and then ultimately paying customers, is to use a strategy that I've used and now I'm teaching with my clients, especially those who want to become known as that thought leader. Dedicate obviously episode 0, but the first 3 episodes of your podcast to really focus on adding incredible value for your audience, but that you know they're going to be want to be listening out for and want to consume, and then using that as your lead and your opt-in, and then nurturing people through that customer journey, the know, like, and trust, but also, you know, the awareness phase, consideration phase, and then ultimately the decision phase. And when you've mapped that out, you can use that strategically across those 3 episodes, the stories you tell and what you share. And it's a great way to funnel people in from the podcast onto your list, because you include that in the outro. And across all the bio and stuff like that.
Let's not discount this. Let's pick up on this. In fact, there's 2 reasons I want to do that. One is that Fran, who's on the call, has a book. You might not know this, but Fran is like this miracle person. She has 3 sets of twins, 1 of each. Like, she has 2 girls, 2 boys, and a double act. She's got, like, she's arguably carried the whole gamut, right? And she wrote a book about that.
Yeah.
Right, which has been very successful. But there's no reason that someone like Fran couldn't have a podcast about what it's like to have twins and what's the challenges of having 2 girls as opposed to 2 boys, as opposed to a double act, you know, a boy and a girl, same age.
Yeah.
And she's written a book about that. She's also an awesome singer, but she's got a book. But that's the sort of thing you're talking about with podcasting. You can have this like little teaser, this little funnel. Okay, I've got a book and the book's awesome, but why don't you have a listen to me speaking about that, in case you would want to just have a little bit of you haven't heard of the book yet. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by a funnel?
Yeah, and so if you're having a look about, if you compare to book and reading, one of the things that I have found, and even research shows, that when people read something, they bring their own perceptions, their own beliefs, their own mindset to that story as they're reading it. Yeah. Yet when you hear someone share the story, if you read LOL or hear someone laugh, like Keith, I often refer to you when I say, I've got a colleague, I never say your name, who has just got a laugh that stops the room, you know, because you've got this boyish laugh that you just can't miss. And so if I was to write about that, but have someone hear that laugh on the podcast, they would know. And so there's a deeper level of understanding. And when I talk about approach, and I'm going to be talking about that in a moment when I introduce what I call my distinction triad, your approach, which is very much centered on a lot of your values, your core values and the experience you want to create. You can't fake that on a podcast. I mean, some people do try to, and you can just absolutely determine who they are, you know, if someone's trying to be something that they're not, but you can get that sense of a personality. So if you think about, you know, and again, every person, if they're thinking about incorporating a podcast, the overall strategy is going to be very different from the outcome that they want. Because depending on what the outcome, say for instance, it's to build a community and increase sales of your book, you might incorporate aspects of that. So, you know, where are people coming into that relationship? Can you deepen the relationship more by sharing stories? Not that you need to create all of the content yourself, but you could look at who in my community is connected to other people who are my ideal clients. Can I get them on my show so that I could provide value to other families who've just become, you know, parents of twins, to help them, but from a complementary subtopic that's, you know, that really provides value to what I'm speaking about. And then of course, if she incorporates snippets of just her experience and maybe just drops very slightly, you know, subtly a reference to a book or something like that, then of course you've just planted that seed And then at the end of that podcast, you might say, by the way, I've created a 3-part interview. It's or series that really the things that I wish I had have been told when I had my first set of twins. By the way, I've also included a couple of chapters. You can get access to that here. Someone signs up for that, and then you've got your nurturing sequence.
It's unbelievable. And it picks up on what Julian was saying about LinkedIn, that, you know, the book is the essence of the idea that Fran in this case has.
Yeah.
But podcasting is like this supplementary channel to say, you know, like, I've got 3 sets of twins, and so I can talk about this at length. You can read my book, and maybe you've heard of that, but here's me speaking about what it's like to have a boy and a girl as twins. And if that's for you, maybe you could get my free chapter. It's like an additional level of support, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, again, it depends on, again, why you're using it, the strategy that you're using. And Julian just put here in the comment section, just so that people don't miss it here if they're watching the recording too, of how to post videos to YouTube and then automatically converted to audio podcasts. One of the things that I want to say to you, Fran, is that here in Australia on CEO Institute, there was an article that spoke about the entrepreneurial customer. And the entrepreneurial customer was made up of 2 demographics, mums and millennials. And the entrepreneurial customer are very much community focused. They want inspiring information. They tend to learn quickly and pick up technology, and they're hanging out in groups and communities online. And so because you're tapping into that mums and even millennials who may also be having, you know, children, if you capture that story, what happens is when you're speaking into that, how many, because it's so niched. I mean, you've even gone further and niche to niche. You've not only had twins, but also had 3 sets of twins. My goodness. You know, they will share that content for you, especially if, you know, some of the key points that you continue to share adds value to them. Yeah. And sometimes it may just be, you know, you bringing your personality in for that approach is, oh, you know, I've had such a difficult day, but you're sharing insights, hope, inspiration, whatever it is that you want to share. But within that, people will resonate because it's exactly what they're, you know, what they're going through too. They feel that you understand them. And then, of course, that allows you then to share some other value, which could be, you know, the book and other things as well. So, but anyway, just hopefully that's, of interest. Just one thing that I do want to say about podcast audiences, and, you know, with some people taking content and then just converting it and pasting it to other, you know, other platforms. Be mindful, because I think because there is a deeper connection with people on a podcast, be mindful about the language and the words that you use, especially if you're doing videos and you're using a lot of words that, you know, see this, because we're hearing that. So with a podcast, if you are stripping content from other platforms and incorporating into that podcast, give it context, right? Share why this is of value. Maybe even share where you've, you know, previously had that piece of content. I'll give you an example. Recently, I was interviewed on a podcast talking about, and that was focused here on local radio, around about face-to-face networking. And, you know, there was some things that I said about how I'm using my podcast to build connections with people, so that I already had built know, like, and trust before I meet them. I'm establishing those relationships before I go cold to a networking event. But I shared some things in that interview that, you know, spoke a little bit more about my story, my journey, and very much about how people could use podcasts as, you know, as part of that, especially if they were introverts. So I wanted to share that with my audience. So before I just stripped that and threw it up into my podcast, so to speak, I gave it context. I shared with people where this was originally done, why I did, how it was going to be valuable for them, so that they didn't feel, oh, well, what is this content? What does this have to do with me? Does that make sense? So be mindful, because, you know, every single platform, especially the content people are consuming and the consumers, is there a nuance to the approach and how they consume that content that you need to be mindful of before you know, kind of strip audios. And sometimes I've heard of people who've just taken a webinar and put it on their podcast, and you say, well, the webinar slide's stuck. Hang on a second. Well, you know, people go, well, this isn't a webinar, this is a podcast. So just be mindful of that. All right, next slide. Podcasting on your terms. Often people say to me, what's the rules about podcasting? I said, well, the good news is there are no rules. And if there are rules, I give you permission to break them. And that is to leverage a piece of technology or whatever it is to suit your style, suit your approach, and obviously the outcome that you are looking for. In particular, in this instance, is that, you need to be yourself. You need to be clear on your approach, how you're going to interact with guests, the storyline, everything, because, you're building a know, like, and trust with your audience. And as you can build that know, like, and trust, you can also break that trust if something untowards will happen. And what I mean by that too is sometimes, from the choice of platform that you decide to host your podcast on, there are a lot of free platforms now that are being, added to the mix of where you can host your podcast. And as a branding strategist by trade, so to speak, I would be often cautioning people, be mindful where you put your podcast. There's a couple of free platforms that some of the top podcasters that I have seen up and running and up and coming, I should say, using. So when I went and listened, the first thing I hear is this ad on iTunes, because the platform throws ads in. That's how they monetize their platforms. And so, I don't want my brand voice to have an ad be added throughout the content that I don't have control about, because your audience will assume that you've given permission because of the fact that that audio that you've created, that content.
Can I just jump in there and say something that might be very relevant here?
Yeah.
There's a very famous cartoon doing the rounds of two pigs in a barnyard.
Yeah.
Saying, isn't that great? We get a roof over our head and the food's free. Right? And they're pigs in a piggery. And they goes, yeah, mate, it's unbelievable. We can eat whatever we want, whenever we want. We don't have to get up. We just lounge about all day. It's completely free. And the premise is, be careful if it's free, because if it's free for you, then you're the product. The fact that you put your podcast on someone else's platform means that they are monetizing that in terms that suit them.
Yes.
Might put an inappropriate ad, an ad that's completely irrelevant, might be a competitor in before yours, and you have no control over that, because you've assumed that, or you've assigned your rights to them because they're hosting it. That's the present they give to you. That's the free food and the lodging. But what they're doing is they're putting an ad in the front and in the back and in the middle, and a key moment which you have no control over. So you're very right to bring that up. Be very strategic where you put your stuff. And free is not always better.
No, and I've heard of one platform, I can't remember which one it was, but suddenly they could not afford to continue maintaining their hosting package. And we had a lot of podcasters that, thankfully, that was, I never used that platform. I've always had a platform that I've paid. I use Blueberry, and there's Libsyn, which you can use too. They're two very good ones. Because I did not want all of a sudden that podcasting host go, I'm sorry, we can't afford to keep in business. Or what they do is they may sell it on to someone else, and again, you pass on your rights, your copyright rights to them to say, well, yep, you can use my content in any way, shape, or form that you want. So just be mindful of that. Some other ways to do podcasting on your own terms as well is to understand, how do you want to create that content? How do you want to be seen? And if you've got that quirky personality, don't listen to anyone that says, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. If it fits your style, your mannerisms, and your quirky sense of humor, then do that, because that's very much how you're also going to be seen and heard if you were meeting someone face to face and so forth. So, there are no rules other than the rules that you set yourself. And I have a rule for myself that, I get to make the rules and I get to break the rules. So, and I think I love what, for myself, obviously, if it fits and if it works, and I'll often break some of those rules. And here's a rule that often, you need to be really consistent. And I used to say that too. Now I have a podcast, Women in Leadership, and I gave myself the rule that if I did not, it's because it's not a main one that I use now or that I produce, unless I find someone who I think is a really great guest. And, even though the consistency isn't there. As soon as I publish a show, we've got listeners there, because I've given myself permission to say I'm only going to bring good guests on, and and I'll keep an eye out for them. So again, the rules are what you set for yourself and what fits your style in your community. And so be mindful as you're adopting something to ensure that it fits in with what you're doing. And in fact, some of the people that I have worked with, they may create a podcast series and not do any other podcast at all episode. And so they're using that 3-part series to build their thought leadership, to be that piece that where they are building, know, like, and trust, but also funneling people into their nurturing sequence. And so when anyone says to them, do you have a podcast? They can now say, well, actually, yes, I do. I have my podcast series. You can access it here so that people can still have that content. They're building a list of people who like audio content. And then down the track, if they want to start an ongoing podcast, they've already got a list of people who they know prefer, that audio content, but they're still using that as part of the know, like, and trust building. Does that make sense? So in other words, there are no rules other than the rules that you put on yourself. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Something else that I wanted to introduce around getting to understand yourself. I have what I call my distinction triad, and that is when you're really looking to build that thought leadership. And without going in too much detail for the triad, I do want to share 3 key points on each of the points of the podcast of the triangle. First point is aptitude. If you draw a triangle, the top of the triangle, aptitude, then the bottom left, attitude, and then bottom right, approach. And so you need to have all of those 3 blended into you as the host. And when you're bringing your message or someone else's message, you have to be so clear on that. So aptitude is obviously your knowledge, your experience, the studies, the courses, all of that, so that you really position yourself as that thought leader. Your attitude very much comes to your mannerisms, your character. And that is where, if you understand that clarity around what makes you unique, that comes through, or should come through, in every single episode that you create. It should also come through in other ways that you're communicating your brand as well. But then on the other side, the approach. This is really centered on your core values, and you have to be clear on, when someone is listening to my podcast or spending time with me, what would be the 3 words that they would describe as the experience that they have had? And once you understand what that experience is, that should then be delivered right throughout your own approach. So through your voice, your mannerisms. It should also come through in the branding of your podcast, from the music that you select, if you do sound effects, that kind of thing. And when you get that complete blend of attitude, approach, and obviously aptitude, you'll have a solid piece of content that's consistent, on brand, and position you as that thought leader. So that's something that I just wanted to mention. Get all of those 3, because sometimes what people do, I'm going to start a podcast and I want to share my expertise, but they don't get clear on, well, how do I want to bring that to the world? What is my approach? What are some core values? What's the experience that I want to create? And then, that attitude, that quirkiness, the mannerisms. So that for some of us, it could be a sense of humor, laughter. It could be whatever it is, but then you bring that forward with far more intention across every single one of your episodes. Because one of the things that I was taught many years ago when I got my first mentor, actually after we parted ways with Career Success Radio, I hired a mentor who came from radio in the US, and they said to me, people come for the topic, but they come back for the host. So that means that if someone finds a topic, they're Googling, and then they find a topic that they're, looking for, and then all of a sudden they like you because you've got a sense of humor, or whatever it is, they'll come back and they'll subscribe. So, if you're not clear on what that is, it's very hard to consistently do that with intention across each and every one of your podcasts. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So some must-dos with your podcast. So important. Start with the end in mind. Start with the end in mind. from your overall podcast. What is the purpose that you are starting your podcast? And if I have a look, there's a framework that I've developed, which is called your podcast profit framework. It starts off with purpose. What's your overall purpose? And then you can get into the planning. Then you can get into the, the production, the publishing, promoting, and then profiting. But often I see people, we're going to start a podcast. Or you've got some player or some, business experts that says, just document. Well, unless you're clear on what it is that you're documenting and where you want to position your thought leadership, you should not say anything, because every single piece of content that you put out there speaks your brand and builds your reputation. And so if you're not clear on that wherever you want to position yourself, get clear on that first before you start, sharing your message. Otherwise, you could be spinning your wheels, or even, sadly, becoming known. You know what Jeff was saying earlier, if you become known as that jack of all trades, unless it sits under a core umbrella where people can see that it's going to get them to an outcome. So what is the outcome of the overall podcast? That will often determine the title of your podcast, the intro, the outro. For instance, I was just talking to one of my colleagues who wants to create her podcast series, and she said, well, I want to be a thought leader in this particular area. So I Googled, and the phrase was still available. And when I looked at the phrase, and podcast.com was still available too. So I said, before you do anything, you need to go and get access to that URL, because that's really where you're going to brand yourself, since she wants to become branded in that particular area. Right through, as I said, to the bio. Because too, when you're looking at SEO purposes, if you've got a key phrase that you want to become known for, if you incorporate that in the title of your podcast, even in the titles of each of your episodes, you've got to do that again. What's the purpose of this episode? That's going to determine, if you know what the outcome is, that's going to determine the storylines as you're planning. What content do we need to share? What does that look like? What are we using this podcast episode if we look at the customer journey? Well, if the customer journey that this podcast is, people are only just starting to get to know you in the three stages that I look at as the customer journey is awareness, consideration, and decision. So awareness, they're only just starting to get aware of you. The consideration is they know you and they think, hey, this is interesting. That, of course, you'd use your podcast series. And then decision is obviously the nurturing process that you take people through. So if you're doing an episode which is specifically speaking into the awareness stage, you know that there's some certain criteria of content that you can incorporate into that episode. Who is your ideal listener? Are they people that require more validation? And there's always some aspect of validation, but what does that look like? So if your audience is accountants, you know that they're going to take a lot longer to come to a decision, because they're very analytical and there's certain triggers in the buying cycle that they need to have. So you'll include some of the statistics and case studies and things like that. And who are you, bringing on to that particular episode? Are you going to do a case study, or are you going to include another expert? So everything has to start with what's the end in mind, and then from there you can plan out the content in that particular episode. Something else that I love looking at when I'm working with clients as far as being able to leverage a podcast is having a look at, are there any issues or are there any concerns or obstacles within that customer buyer's journey that can perhaps be leveraged and overturned, transformed through use of a podcast. Let me give you an example. I was talking to an accounting firm, and they said, well, one of the things that we struggle with is that we have existing clients who come to us once a year and, to do their tax and compliance. Here in Australia, we can do that, annually once a year. And a lot of them are tradies. So I said to them, well, why not create a podcast episode or series that's specifically designed and tailored for your existing clients, but to inform them of some of the other services that you offer. Now, you don't want this to be an infomercial. So what you do is you have a look at your customers and go, right, once they've seen you, what are some of the struggles? What are some of the challenges that they are challenged with as far as business? Maybe succession planning. Maybe it is that in that construction industry, there's a high tax because it's quite a highly paid industry. How are they going to minimize tax? And then you start to create a show which focuses specifically on that area. You incorporate some case studies, some insights, to share information with them. What they don't yet know. And then the call to action could be, if you're interested and want to speak, ring up your accountant who already knows you, and let's set up a time to chat. And then rather than distributing that to a whole cold audience, use the ways that you are already communicating with your existing clients and get that content out there. So, you're leveraging your podcast in a way that's going to speak into possibly a challenge that you're struggling with your existing customers in this instance. And how often do our customers not know the full extent of what we're able to provide? But if you can storytell and do it in a way that adds value and insights into something that they're already struggling with, that's a great way to build customer retention, so that they don't meet an accountant that would say, oh, well, we do that. How often does that happen? And why are you leaving us? Well, we wanted to get more succession planning in place. Well, we offered that service. Sorry, I didn't know. So, I think you can use that and then leverage your podcast to be able to support you in that area. But
can I just jump in and support what you've just said there? And I want to see if Julian's got a similar example. You and I both spoke at an event in the city a few weeks ago, and a guy who spoke was talking about how this very, very, very proactive regional bank noticed that most of their clients were farmers that were in the tractor a lot of the time. And they were in the tractor 10 hours a day. And by the time they got back to the office, so to speak, back home, they didn't have time to do anything. They didn't have time to read, keep up with the tax and stuff. So what they were doing is they did this podcast specifically designed around the people that they knew were in a tractor 10 hours a day, looking for stuff to do. Like they were just dying from boredom. And then they were rushing home and trying to fill in the 2 hours that they were awake with tax and bookwork and reading about compliance and catching up. So they made this very, very, very quick assumption that there's a big block of time where people couldn't be on a computer, but they could be doing a podcast. And they had this huge increase in engagement and loyalty around those clients to say, you know what, you've just given me a key piece of information there. I've been in this tractor 10 hours today, and I learned something really important that I would never have had time to think about in the 2 hours that I'm awake after dinner.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of where that's starting to play out, Julian, in the world of really multi-purposing depending on client needs?
So let me think. In terms of, for sure, you just never know where things come from. And I think the example that I would say is more that, I've had a number of instances where someone would say, oh, I really love what you said here. And when I go and see what it was that they were referring to, it was something that I had posted 2 years ago. Or 3 years ago, so sometimes, you get the sense that these things sort of, certainly, for example, on platforms like LinkedIn, you get the sense sometimes that, you post something, it's around for 4 days and then it disappears into the ether. And yet, I consistently find that all of a sudden, that somebody might come in and respond to something that you did months ago or even years ago.
It really is the long tail, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, and you spoke to that earlier about it being sort of a long game. There's an accumulation over time. I think that's another thing, is that, you come out and you do one podcast or two podcasts, and a lot of people do sort of give up right away after, because, understandably, there's effort and time involved. But, it's something that Jeff spoke to. No matter at any point in time that somebody wants to sees a post or something that you did and they're a little curious, they start to check you out.
Yeah.
And once they start to investigate, it's that volume and accumulation of material. They say, oh, okay, it's not like this person just sort of hopped on one day and did it. And it's also has been my experience, one, that it actually accumulates a lot faster than you might anticipate. That, all of a sudden, you kind of look, it's not until you kind of look back and then you look at your podcast list or your YouTube page, whatever it is, and say, oh my gosh, I've got 50, 100 videos, and all of a sudden, and you didn't even realize that you had done that much. So it's definitely something that I encourage people to do. And then with the podcasting, again, that's not like, because I think Annemarie made a very good point. I've thrown my stuff. I've gone with video. I've had people come in through the podcast. And even that alone is a surprise to me, because I've really just automated it and I really don't nurture it. So mine is much more of a visual platform. I really think it speaks to, again, what Annemarie was saying, about how there are no rules. All of this technology is so new that, if you're doing it, you're a pioneer. And so many times, the rules, I hear, in fact, there is a slide in my presentation coming up where, people often say, oh, if you're doing a video, for example, you want little sound bites, snippets. It should be 30 seconds. It should be 1 minute. Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced of that, because what we're finding, and you look at the success of really, really successful podcasts, shows like, let's say, like the Joe Rogan show, which has just absolutely exploded internationally. He just did it for fun. And then next thing you know, and a lot of people were telling him, oh, you got to cut that down and trim it up down. And what we're seeing is that there's this appetite for long form content.
Yeah.
People
said that a few times. Have you noticed that to be a trend?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a trend that I've certainly gravitated towards. I think, for sure, the thing with long form is that, in the case of even with Fran tonight, it's like people, maybe you do a show for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and somebody can only listen in for one, so be it. And then again, you as the producer can always, go back and take out snippets and reuse it and repurpose it. But I think I think we're so used to, there's no doubt that, people's days are and time is limited. So there is this, quick scrolling through, but I think it is almost, demeaning in a way when we say that people just don't have the attention span for any of this stuff. It's not true. I think in reality, people are a lot smarter than we sort of give them credit for. And there's an appetite for this stuff. So, every time that somebody, says, oh, here's the rule, rules are definitely made to be broken, especially in technology that is so new, that, sometimes maybe breaking that rule is that differentiator that all of a sudden makes you stand out.
Yeah.
Well, if I pick up on what you've just said there, which is absolutely gold, and talk about what happened last week for us, all three of us, on a really brand new site called StreamYard. That long form content went for 57 minutes. And, people could have been forgiven for not staying around for that whole time. So what I did was I created little snippets, which I'm going to talk about in my slides. And those 2-minute snippets tease out the key points. But there's a link back to the longer form. So that if you are inspired by what Julian said about long form content and we pique your interest, you can go back to the Periscope feed where the whole thing is there. And so I think you're exactly right that there is a tendency based on time to watch smaller things, but there is an appetite for the longer play when there's something of interest. And that it's
it's what Annemarie was saying earlier too, about how so people come in for the title and then come back for the host.
Yeah.
So sometimes you're right that usually those little snippets are the thing that draws somebody in. But once they like you, that's a whole different story. Now they want to hear. Now they want to hear everything you have to say.
Yeah, they'll binge listen to every single episode. And something to add to the point of what Julian's saying, which I think is really important, you've got to know your audience. One of my clients, her podcast is 15 minutes or less, and that's because her target market are mums, and she's figuring out that they will listen to her podcast when they're dropping off kids or picking them up, and they've got a few minutes in the car while they're waiting for school to finish. So she knows specifically, who it's targeted for and, where they'll be when they're listening, similar to what you were saying, Keith, with the bank. But one of the things, and I'm just about to wrap up here because I can't wait to hear what Julian has to say as well, and you, Keith, is that you have to have that clarity around all of the platforms. You know, everything that you are doing needs to speak that brand, and, you know, don't just ignore other platforms and just focus on podcasting. It's with anything, it needs to be this integrated approach. So if you are incorporating podcasts with particularly if you're an introvert, you don't do very much networking, it may very well be that if someone wants to know a little bit more about your part of the relationship, you're incorporating some episodes that you know is of real value and allows you to build that relationship. But an interesting story, and someone once asked me, why are there 3 episodes? Why do you suggest 3 episodes in, say, that thought leadership podcast series? Was when I started Women in Leadership podcast back in, I think it was 2015, I had 3 shows that I published. Now, I started Women in Leadership podcast after a business partnership failed. It was the worst business failure I'd ever experienced. And I really looking back, could see that, it was a shock to my system. And I thought, well, I was burned out after 18 months of building this 7-figure pipeline. It all fell apart. Anyway, long story short, I started that podcast as a way to pick myself up, because I thought, I don't want to write anymore because I just couldn't put 2 words together, but I can interview people. And I'm going to surround myself with other incredible women who are up to great stuff, who have gone through similar challenges as I have. And I want to help them share their story whilst also benefiting myself. So I had a bit of a selfish reason for starting that. Now, I had 3 episodes up on my website. And within just a couple of days of publishing the last episode, I had phone calls from people who had no idea who I was. They'd Googled, they were looking for branding, coach, found a couple of episodes of podcasts, listened to all 3. Both of them rang me and pretty much said, we want to work with you. What's the best, package? And so through listening to that episode, I mean, I was the host, I was interviewing other people, but it was sitting on my website. So, they could get a whole sense of the brand story, who I was, what Julian was talking about. People will do a little bit of stalking around you. So you need to make sure that that consistent message is there on your podcast. If you're doing videos, if you're sharing, on Twitter, so that when people start to consume that that podcast content, as well as read articles and so forth, it is consistent, and it's going to position you as that go-to person in the particular area that you're really wanting to be seen as that thought leader.